we're beginning a brand new message series called Life in Babylon. And I'll explain that title a little later. But to start this series off, I want to focus on this word right here, integrity. Integrity. There are several definitions for the word integrity, but for this series, we're going to use this definition. Integrity is the resolve and courage to do the right and noble thing because it's the right and noble thing. No matter what pressure comes our way, no matter the opposition, you do the right thing. You do the right thing when it benefits you, and you do the right thing when it costs you. You do the right thing when it's popular, and you do the right thing when it's unpopular. You do the right thing when it's hard, and you do the right thing when it's easy. People with integrity just do the right thing. In fact, we cheer for people who do the right thing in the midst of opposition. There's never a good excuse to not do what you know is the right thing to do. Now, some of you might be familiar with this phrase, structural integrity, especially if you have any experience with contracting, construction. If you've ever been around people who built buildings, you understand this word. Structural integrity is a building science phrase. And here's the technical definition of structural integrity. It's the ability of a structure to withstand its intended load without failing due to fracture or fatigue. We've seen what happens to buildings that lack structural integrity. The damage is not isolated to the compromised beam. The entire structure is affected because when a load-bearing structure fails, the load is transferred to and potentially overloads surrounding support structures. The failure of one structure or the failure of one beam impacts the entire building. Because the load is transferred, other parts of the building is affected. Now, I'm sure you can tell where I'm going with this. The same is true for you, and the same is true for me. The same is true for all of us. A failure of personal integrity impacts the people around us. When you fail morally, it doesn't just stay with you. It impacts the people around you. When you fail financially, it doesn't just impact you, it impacts the people around you. When parents fail, it doesn't just impact the parent, but it impacts the entire household. Your personal failure doesn't remain personal. Entire companies have imploded because of the personal failure of a CEO. Churches have fell apart because of the personal failure of a pastor or one of its leaders. The load is always transferred. It never stays with you. Your personal failure impacts the people around you. From one generation to the next, when one generation fails, it impacts the next generation. That's why we have generational curses, generational poverty, generational addictions, generational abuse. If we have a thief in the neighborhood, it's a community problem. Drug dealers in the neighborhood, a community problem. Prostitutes, rebellious children, a community problem. And then it goes from a community problem to a city problem. and then to a state problem, and then to a nation problem, and ultimately it becomes a world problem. The opposite is also true. When we maintain our integrity, it impacts the people around us. And because of this, those of you who have been around for a while, you know that integrity used to be a universal expectation. We held people accountable to be people of integrity. We held people accountable to do the right thing. But now we make excuses for bad behavior. Come on. We let people off the hook. And integrity should be a universal expectation because, after all, my kids are growing up in the same world as your kids. And so what your kids do impact my kids, and what my kids do impact your kids. And so this is a really, really big deal. When it comes to the world that we live in, I don't know anything more important than integrity. In other words, your world, your integrity, our world. My integrity, our world. Fathers, your integrity, your home. Your integrity, our church. Your integrity, our community. Because we're all affected by the behavior of one another. There's no way around that. And so there's no such thing as this is your business, this is my business. Your business impacts my business. And so we have to get to a place where we're holding people accountable. We can no longer make excuses for bad behavior. This is a game that the government loves for us to play. And the reason why is because when the people are not guided by integrity, integrity is used as a tool that the government uses to get its way until integrity gets in the way. Which leads to a little bit of a history lesson that I want to share with you today that I believe will help us to make sense of where we are as a nation and where we are as the church today. Because as you guys know, history has a way of repeating itself. When we don't learn from our past mistakes, we are likely to repeat them. That's why Sidney Harris said it this way. History repeats itself, but in such a cunning disguise that we never detect the resemblance until the damage is done. We have to learn from past mistakes. And so here's the backstory to the story that we're going to look at today. God's people, the nation of Israel, had it good. Somebody say they had it good. They had it real good. First and foremost, they were God's people. And God gave them three things. He gave them land, He gave them law, and most importantly, He gave them Himself. They squandered that. They wanted to be like everybody else. And so they started to worship the gods of the pagans around them. All the cool kids want to be like everybody else. Everybody wants to wear Jordans. Everybody wants to wear Gucci. Just like everybody else. They wanted to be like everyone else. This idol worship displeased God. They were disobedient. They rebelled against God. They lived as if there was no God. That's how they got in the situation that they were in. Things went from bad to worse. But how did they get there? How did they go from having favor with God to being oppressed by their enemies? How did they go from being blessed to being cursed? the same way we do. A breach of integrity. A breach of integrity. They disobeyed God. They started living as if there was no God. They started committing sexual acts that God said they shouldn't do. They started having sex in ways that God said they shouldn't have sex. Widespread bloodshed. And because of this, God gave them over. Imagine being in a situation where God gives you over to your enemies. That means that you're losing to people that you should be winning against. God gave them over. Not only are you at odds with your enemy, but you're also at odds with God. Daniel chapter 1 tells us that in 605 BC, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Yep. The land that God gave them, God's chosen people, now their enemy has come in and conquered this land. It goes on to say, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into the hands of Babylon. It was the Lord that gave him over. He lost his favor. And because he lost his favor, the entire nation had to deal with the consequences. Everybody wasn't doing the wrong thing. But you know how it goes. The load is always transferred. Are you guys with me? There comes a point in time where God says, enough is enough. You've gone too far with your rebellion. You've gone too far with your perversion. You've gone too far with your idolatry. And when the Lord gave me this message to preach, I said, Lord, why? This is a tough one. Because I know I'm not going to get a lot of amens with a message like this. But I got to declare the entire counsel of God, the entire will of God. That sometimes we need to be warned about judgment to come. Sometimes we need to be warned about the behavior of the people around us, our behavior, and how it impacts all of us. And so let me show you how this life in Babylon really is if you want to be like everybody else. Let me show you what it's like to be like everybody else. Now you're in Babylon. And life in Babylon is a lot different from life in Jerusalem. It's a lot different when you have the favor of God and now you're experiencing the curses of God and the judgment of God. Life in Babylon, where integrity is now defined and redefined by personal and public opinion. Are you guys with me? Life in Babylon, where integrity is defined and redefined by the popular and the powerful. What did this look like for the people of God? Nebuchadnezzar had a strategy. Isolation. Separated from their family. And then indoctrination. Change the way that they think. And finally, apostatization. Change their beliefs. Neb isolated the best and the brightest. And look at what Daniel chapter 1 verse 3 and 4 says. It says, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Now watch the people that he chose. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He had a strategy. wasn't just going after anybody, he was going after the young men. He wasn't just going after the young men, but he was going after the young men with talents, with gifts, with abilities, the sharp young men. He wanted to wipe out that generation. Young teenagers, 14, 15, 16 years old, isolating them from their families, indoctrinating them, changing their belief system. Neb took them through a series of things to de-Israelitize them and then pro-Babylonize them. The plan was to separate them from their family, the way they were raised, and to get them to think like Babylonians so that they can behave like Babylonians. History has a way of repeating itself. The enemy's strategy has not changed. He started with the dismantling of the family. And that's exactly what we're experiencing now in our society today. The dismantling of the family. 70% of households, children are growing up in households with one parent. And it's become normal. And we think that this doesn't impact our community. The load is always transferred. Children who grow up in a household without a father are more likely to commit crimes, go to jail and go back to jail. They're more likely to use drugs. They're more likely to use their bodies in ways that God didn't design them to use their bodies. The load is always transferred. You get them to think like Babylonians so that they can behave like Babylonians. You got to indoctrinate the mind. Once you indoctrinate the mind, it impacts the behavior. He moved them from isolation to indoctrination. Verse 5 tells us he was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. He sent them to Babylonian University. And then it says, the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years. And after they were to enter into the king's service, he wanted to make sure that they were prepared. He wanted to make sure that this indoctrination set in. Verse 7 tells us, among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now we get to the upbringing of these young boys that Nebuchadnezzar selected. Their parents gave them a divine identity. Each one of their names had a divine identity. Daniel means God is my judge. Hananiah means Yah has been gracious. Mishael, who is what God is. Azariah, Yah has helped. They were raised with a divinely oriented way of thinking. Yet they found themselves oppressed by their enemies, oppressed by the Babylonians. How could this be? They didn't do anything wrong. Their parents raised them right. But the load is always transferred. There's no way around it. Your integrity, our world. Even if you're doing the wrong thing, it's not isolated just to you. It impacts me and my children as well. That's why we have to hold each other accountable. As a part of Neb's indoctrination strategy, he attempts to change their identity. Are you guys with me? He attempts to change their identity by changing their name. He changes Daniel's name to Belshazzar. Baal will protect. And then he changes Hananiah's name to Shadrach, inspired of a coup. And then he changes Mishael's name to Meshach, belonging to a coup. And he changes Azariah's name to Abednego. Because your name is your identification. Names in those days meant something. Neb gave them Babylonian names. And changing their name was his attempt to change their belief system. Changing their name was his attempt to change their identity. And so Neb took them to a series of things, and this is so similar to what we're seeing in our society today. This identity crisis, where you can identify as whoever you want to identify. That's one thing, but then now they're saying that we need to accept it as well. And so they're living in Babylon. And just like they were living in Babylon, we are living in Babylon today. Now some of you say, what is Babylon? I'm glad you asked. The opposition to the rule of God by world powers, or the exile of God's people from the land of blessing. Christians have lost home field advantage. We are no longer the home team. The crowd is no longer supporting us. There was a time when our voice meant something. Now it's just flat out disrespect. The culture has declared war on Christianity. We are the visiting team. We no longer live in a land that holds high the Judeo-Christian worldview. Brothers and sisters, Christianity is on the verge of being canceled. Are you guys with me? Christianity is on the verge of being canceled. Somebody needs to say it. Christianity is on the verge of being canceled. I know we want to hear about, messages about how to get booed up and relationship goals and all of that, but somebody needs to say this, that Christianity is on the verge of being canceled. And the more serious you are about your faith, the more likely you are to be canceled. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We are living in a post-Christian society. God's definition of marriage, God's definition of male and female realities, God's definition of dignity, God's definition of appropriateness has put us at odds with the culture. And so here's the question. How did we get here? How did we get here? How did we go from being influential to being on the verge of being canceled? How did we go from being powerful to being almost irrelevant? How did we go from experiencing God's favor to being in Babylon? The same way the Israelites did. A breach of integrity. History in repeat. And as a result, we have lost home field advantage. And as a result of losing home field advantage, many Christians have decided to become treasonous and Benedict Arnolds. And this is challenging because the Benedict Arnolds still go to church. This is challenging because the Benedict Arnolds still preach the gospel. They still lead over worship. But the load is always transferred. It's clear how God's people ended up in Babylon. There was a breach of integrity, and as a result, the Lord gave them over. And I believe that the same thing is happening to us. There was a time when followers of Jesus Christ took pride in being followers of Jesus Christ. We all had a life verse, and this was our life verse, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God. The gospel is the power of God. I'm not ashamed of this. It is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. First to the Jew, and then to the Gentile. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. A righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. But because of this breach of integrity, we are here. And Paul tells us what happens when we get here. Watch this sobering commentary and tell me whether or not this resembles where we are. I don't even need to ad-lib on this. It's going to preach itself. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people. What do? They suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, it's obvious. How could you deny the existence of God? Because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities are no longer invisible. His eternal attributes and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. Look around, there's a sun, there's a moon, there's a star, there's stars. People, all of this DNA, nobody's exactly the same. Paul says because of that, people are without excuse. For although they knew God, this is so sobering, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. We live in an ungrateful society where people refuse to glorify God, where people refuse to thank God, but their thinking became futile. And their foolish hearts were darkened. It was already dark, but it got darker. Although they claimed to be wise. If you don't believe me, look on social media. If you don't believe me, talk to your kids. They think they're wise. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles, making up their own God. Watch this. Therefore, God gave them over. Are you guys with me? This is sobering commentary. This is our reality. Therefore, God gave them over. Watch this. Christianity is on the verge of being canceled. We're not far from it being illegal to preach this. We're not far from it being illegal to read this. Therefore, God gave them over in their sinful desires, in the sinful desires of their hearts, to sexual immaturity and impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. Look around. The perversion is getting worse. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever to be praised. Can you believe this is in the Bible? That was written thousands of years ago. It's in the Bible. This is our reality. People are worshiping things God created instead of worshiping God. Because of this, says it again, God gave them over. He says it 3 times. To their shameful lusts. Even their women. Now, this is so unpopular. It's going to make some of you uncomfortable, but it's in the Bible. I didn't write this. It's in the Bible. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with one another. Now remember, God gave them over and received in themselves due penalty for their error. The consequences are tied to the choices. God gave them over. Women sleeping with women, men sleeping with men. There are consequences for that. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, here it is again. So God gave them over to a depraved mind. A lot of what we see today is mental illness. Let's just call it what it is. To a depraved mind. So that they do what they ought not be done, so that they do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy, although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death. Watch this. They not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. I can feel our subscribers numbers going down as I preach. This is not popular. Some people are not going to come back because of this. And to some degree, I wish I didn't have to preach this because I want to see the church grow and grow. I want to see a lot of people in the church. But this is in the Bible. And this explains everything. This is not to say that everyone compromised, but the load always transfers. That's why we have to hold people accountable. Whether you compromised or not, we are all caught up in the judgment of God. And I believe to some degree God has handed us over. He certainly handed some people over. Many of today's universities are God-denying universities. Most of what we see on media, God-denying news. And if you don't think you've been brainwashed, think about how less it bothers you now than how it used to bother you. We become numb to this. In fact, some people have jumped over and just said, you know what, maybe that was back then. Maybe this is something different now. We've become accepting of it, and we even promote it. We politicized this thing, and we now call what God says wrong normal. The enemy has captured the minds of the emerging generation, and now our children have sophisticated arguments to say that what God says is wrong is now right. And we're bowing down to it. Re-educating our children to think that they can choose their sexual identity. We are a culture in decline, and we are declining rapidly. Our spiritual enemy is doubling down on the isolation, he's doubling down on the indoctrination, and he's doubling down on the apostatization. That leads to the obvious question, and I'm almost done. Where do we go from here? How do we live for God in Babylon? The answer is found in verse 8 of Daniel chapter 1. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself. Daniel exercised integrity. You know what that's saying? We have to draw the line in the sand. We have to draw the line in the sand. What does it mean to draw the line in the sand? I looked up a definition that works perfectly. To draw the line in the sand means there's a point beyond which one will not go. A limit to what one will do or accept. And it starts at home. Daniel's resolve didn't happen by accident. He was raised right. He was raised to have integrity. I've made some mistakes as a parent, but one of the best decisions I made was to raise my children in the ways of the Lord. Because of that, all of my children have a relationship with God. They had to go to church when they were growing up. It was not negotiable. Don't play that sick stuff with me. I knew all the games that kids play. Trying to act like you sick. We just had this conversation a couple of weeks ago. They said Dad was always 2 steps ahead of us. You better believe it. I seen the direction the culture was going in. And I got on their social media and I looked at what they were posting. I looked at what their friends were posting. I looked at what their friends' friends were posting. I did investigations to find out about their friends' parents. I did all that because I seen the direction that we were going in. And I have absolutely no regrets. None at all. I was a little bit concerned during the BLM riots. I started seeing them kind of jump on that bandwagon. And I started to say something, and the Lord told me, just step back. You attached a bungee cord to them. You taught them the way to go, and they're only going to go so far. That bungee cord is going to snap them right back into reality. And I'm telling you, things started to get crazy for them. And they said, let me jump off this bandwagon. And even today, they'll tell me, Dad, you finally coming around. Because they're starting to see some of the things I told them a long time ago. And they're trying to take credit for it. Dad, you finally starting to come around. I'll give you that. I'll give you that. We got to raise our children in the ways of the Lord. And so Daniel drew a line in the sand. Are you willing to draw a line in the sand? When it comes to how you date, are you willing to draw a line in the sand and say, I'm not going to cross this line? When it comes to how you spend your money, are you willing to draw a line in the sand and say, I'm not going to cross this line? When it comes to how you raise your kids, are you willing to draw the line and say, I'm not going to cross this line, and I'm going to teach my kids to not cross this line? We need courageous parents. Where are the courageous parents? Parents are scared of their children. The children are running the house. And the parents are afraid to challenge their children. I seen a reel the other day where a man sat in front of his father and his mother. And he said, I'm having a wedding. I'm getting married to another man. Are you going to come to my wedding? And the mother had the courage to say, no. I'm not coming to your wedding. I love you, but I don't support that lifestyle. None of my kids, if they ever got involved in anything like that, would ever expect for me to come to their wedding. I will love you. I will respect you. I will treat you right with dignity because you are my child and you were created in the image of God. We don't hate gay people. We love gay people. But we do not endorse that lifestyle. That's where we draw the line. I'll take your job, but I'm not going to deny my God. I'll even go to your awareness training, but I'm not going to deny my God. We have to draw a line in the sand. That's one point of application for today's message. You have to decide where you're going to draw the line in the sand. One more story and I'm done. You guys know, the whole vax thing versus unvax, it's your business, right? If you choose to get vaxxed, that's your business. If you choose not to get vaxxed, that's your business. We had a situation in the house where they tried to put pressure on Kenneth to get a vaccination. And they said, if you don't get this vaccine, you're getting kicked out. And Kenneth loved being at the house. I don't know anybody that loved being at the house more than Kenneth. Kenneth said, if I got to get kicked out, I got to get kicked out. I never seen him stand up like that for anything. But that was his position. We have to have the courage to draw the line in the sand. My wife works for American Airlines. And American Airlines was making all of their employees get the vaccine. If you don't get the vaccine, you're going to get fired. My wife said, that's why I draw the line in the sand. I'm not taking that shot. This is not for the vax or against the vax. We just have to know where to draw the line in the sand and stand on it. We have to have the courage to stand on it. Because of that, the text tells us, now God. See, when we decide, God acts. We want God to act before we decide. God is not answering my prayers. Have you decided? Have you drawn a line in the sand? I've been praying about my rebellious children and they're still rebels. Have you decided? See, I want to pastor a church with people that are favored by God. And the only way that we can experience God's favor is we have to pre-decide. We have to decide. We have to draw a line in the sand. I'm not going to deny my God. I'm going to stand on my convictions, whether it's popular or not popular, because that's integrity. And when there's a breach in your integrity, it affects me and it affects you, but I want you to be favored. It says, now God calls the officials to show favor and compassion to Daniel, because he drew a line in the sand. That's the application.